Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about perhaps one of the most iconic planes from the Second World War, the North American P-51 Mustang. First flown in late 1940 and first seen combat missions in January 1942, not as an American plane, but rather as an American-made, Lend-Lease, or more accurately, cash and carry, aircraft sold to the British and used in their air forces as the Mustang Mark I. Initially conceived as a way to supplement the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk also being purchased by the British, the Mustang early on was a bit different than what it would eventually become known for. It had relatively poor high-altitude performance due to its Allison V1710 engine. Not a poor engine in of itself, but without any kind of super or turbocharger, the early Mustangs ended up being relegated to more low-altitude or less intensive missions, like either ground attack roles or reconnaissance. These early Mustangs, though, would serve rather admirably, if a bit quietly, in these early roles, but it would only end up gaining the fame it now has about 2 years later, in early 1944, when America's search for an escort fighter, after their idea of only using the defensive weaponry of the bombers for defense failed, brought them to the Mustang. By this point, an experiment that swapped out the Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine resulted in significantly improved speed and high-altitude performance. Combine this with the fact that its large frame could hold a significant amount of fuel, this made it an exceptional long-range escort fighter and a pretty solid fighter aircraft in general. While not necessarily exceptional in any area other than the range, that range made it an incredibly important aircraft that would escort bomber sortie after bomber sortie, matching up pretty solidly against German Bf-109s and FW-190s, and outclassing their heavy fighter, the Bf-110. Over in the Pacific Theater, partly due to America's air offensive being driven by carrier planes, partially because Europe needed the escort fighters much more, the Mustang didn't have as glorious a career it ended up having in Europe, with it arriving in early 1945, and Japan at this point being on life support. The Mustang had a much easier go of things, all things considered, against the now outdated Japanese Zero. Indirectly, the Mustang would help level Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands and affecting millions of Japanese civilians. Thinking about it, the Mustang took part in a great deal of civilian turmoil all around the globe. While I could keep going with the career of this Mustang, that's not what we're here to talk about today. Instead, we're here to talk about the Mustang, the other Mustang. Yes, there was another Mustang during World War II that was technically different than the Mustang, but effectively it was just a Mustang. This is the North American A-36 Mustang, also officially known as the Apache, or by some as the Invader. The story of this not Mustang begins in 1942, with the continuing export of the Mark I Mustangs to Britain. While these initial Mustangs, again, were more limited than their later versions, Britain and the Royal Air Force were still quite happy with the performance of their Mustangs, and they wanted more of them. While they would eventually receive more in updated variants that they would call the Mark 1A, Mark II, Mark III, and Mark IV, likely because of Britain's enthusiasm for the design, the president of North American Aviation pushed the U.S. military for a contract to produce Mustangs for the U.S. Army Air Forces, the design in the U.S. being designated the P-51. The U.S. military was receptive to this push and seemed pretty enthusiastic about the design as well, but there was a problem that was out of their hands. This was not a mechanical problem, but more of a clerical problem. With the way the US government functions, a certain amount of money is earmarked for certain things. The budget for the military, for example, isn't really just a pot of money that everyone can pull from. Departments and projects are allocated a certain amount. The problem for the military and for North American aviation in 1942 was that money designated for new fighter projects and contracts had already been spent or allocated, so there simply wasn't money available for US P-51 fighter aircraft. Some P-51s were made in 1942, but these were already earmarked ones for the British and their purchases. Still, because the Mustang was a solid aircraft, the military wanted to produce Mustangs for them any way they could, and they would find a workaround. While there was not money for a fighter aircraft, there was money for an attack aircraft. So the workaround was that the Mustang design would be ever so slightly altered to better fit a ground attack and dive bomber role. These alterations would be rather subtle, and at a glance it would be difficult to differentiate the attack variant from the fighter variant, but there were some differences. Those differences wouldn't be in the dimensions, though. Measuring in at 9.83 meters long, 11.28 meters wide, and 3.71 meters tall, the dimensions of the attack variant were exactly the same as the fighter variant. With a gross weight of about 10,000 pounds, it was also just about as heavy as the fighter. Additionally, at this stage of the Mustang's life, the engine was still the Allison V1710 with 1,325 horsepower. That engine would carry over to the attack variant. For all intents and purposes, there would be three major differences between these two planes. For one, as it was to be a dive bomber, cast aluminum dive brakes would be added to the wings, with 2 brakes per wing, one on top and one below. These brakes essentially look like the metal air vents you have in your house, which are apparently called registers. These brakes were quite small, maybe a quarter the length of the wing. They achieved their purpose though, so that's what matters. With the addition of these dive brakes, the frame of the plane would have to be structurally reinforced to help it stand up to the increased G-forces it would experience going into and coming out of a dive. Lastly, there was the addition of underwing bomb racks that could hold up to 1,000 pounds of explosives. As the attack variant was effectively just a slight variant of an already established model, the Mark I Mustangs, a contract for 500 of them was awarded on April 16, 1942, and the plane would receive the designation and name of A-36A Apache. Roughly 5 months later, in September 1942, the first A-36 model was completed, and it would first fly the next month in October. Surprisingly, or perhaps actually not surprisingly, depending on your perspective, early testing of the A-36 as a dive bomber didn't actually go all that well. Initially, before even flying, the A-36 was already on the back foot, as U.S. Army higher-ups weren't too keen on the concept of dive bombing. They thought it was too dangerous. So the A-36 would have to really stand out to help assuage their concerns. In testing, it was found that the A-36's top speed in level flight was around 360 miles an hour, and in a dive, that speed could hit upwards of 500 miles an hour. For comparison's sake, look at the Ju-87 Stuka, one of the most iconic dive bombers ever. Its max speed at level flight was just 210 miles an hour, with a dive speed upwards of 370. To put it mildly, the A-36 was absolutely hurling itself towards the ground. Because of this speed, though, much greater stress was placed on the wings when pulling up, and as a result, on one particular test dive without the dive brakes, with the pilot diving at 450 miles an hour, the wings would be completely ripped off on the pull-up just from the force alone. While this incident was the most catastrophic, there were a great deal of other accidents and incidents during testing and training. When the dive brakes were enabled, this would reduce the dive speed to 390 miles an hour max, but apparently this was not enough for military higher-ups. As a result of the high rate of training accidents, it was recommended that the dive angle be restricted to 70 degrees maximum, still quite steep all things considered, and it was recommended that the dive brakes later be outright removed, and that the A-36 should serve mainly as a low-altitude attack plane. With 650 caliber machine guns and potentially 1,000 pounds of explosives to its name, it certainly would be able to adequately perform in this role as well. Still, despite it being recommended that the dive bombing of the plane be restricted, a good number of pilots flying the A-36 simply ignored those warnings and did what they wanted to do anyway, often to very good success. Generally speaking, when dive bombing with the A-36, pilots would climb up to 12,000 feet before breaking into a vertical dive. Again, many ignored the safety recommendation for the dive angle, before they would release their explosives at somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 feet before sharply pulling up. Of course, there was variance to this, but we can say that this was about the standard operation for the A-36. Some groups and pilots flew a bit higher and released higher, some flew lower and released lower. The first A-36s would join the war in April 1943 after being sent to French Morocco in North Africa to be flown by the 27th Fighter Bomber Group and the 86th Fighter Bomber Group. 2 months later, the A-36 would fly in its first combat missions in the prelude to the invasion of Sicily with the attack and occupation of the island of Pantelleria, just off the coast of Sicily. In these initial engagements that saw the 12,000-strong Italian force surrender just as Allied forces landed, the A-36 showed itself to be a very solid aircraft, and despite initial concerns from the testing that the dive bombing was dangerous, these concerns didn't seem to manifest. Of course, dive bombing was inherently rather dangerous, to be sure, but the accident rate in particular didn't seem to carry over into combat. Flying further missions into the Allied invasion of Sicily, the A-36 would not only prove itself to be a solid dive bomber, but a solid ground attacker, and in a pinch, a decent enough fighter. At this point, at least 300 A-36s were in the Mediterranean, and units like the 27th and 86th would be sent out for dive bombing and mopping up enemy encampments, and or providing strafing run support. Generally speaking, after a plane released its explosives on the dive bomb, the pilot would return to base, but on that return he would engage in ground attacking when convenient. After their dive bombing run, the A-36s would generally stay low to the ground. There was no real point in climbing back up. And on the return, when they happened to come across enemy positions, they would give it a little strafing run with their 50 caliber machine guns before moving on. This did not occur in the opposite order, though. If a plane was deployed for strafing and ground attacking, it typically would not be equipped with the explosives that would be used in dive bombing. In this specific role, those explosives were just added weight and potentially added danger. In these ground attacking roles, pilots would still utilize the dive brakes, though, not for any mechanical use, but rather for some psychological use. Just as a dive bomber like the Stuka had a siren that was to terrify those it targeted, the dive brakes of the A-36 had an unintended effect of doing something similar. The wind passing over the slotted metal created a loud whistling sound, perhaps not entirely different than the Stuka. This gave the A-36 a nickname from some German soldiers, the Screaming Devil or the Screaming Helldiver. And while the A-36 was not at all intended to serve as a fighter, in a pinch it worked decently well. In a one-on-one matchup, all things being equal, the A-36 was definitely not as good as German Bf-109s or Fw-190s, but the A-36 did manage to take down quite a few German fighters, heavy fighters, bombers, and transports, all in all taking down somewhere between 80 and 100 enemy aircraft. This combination of solid dive bombing, ground attacking, and pinch-hitting fighter work made the A-36 a rather well-respected and well-liked plane. At some point, members of the 27th petitioned for the A-36 to be called the Invader, and this was accepted, although rarely was it ever used. Of course, though, good things can't last forever, and by late 1944 and early 1945, the A-36 would just about disappear from the battlefield. This would be due to a combination of combat losses, general attrition, and the production of actual P-51 fighters. Because of the inherent danger of dive bombing and ground attacking, you were putting the plane much more directly in harm's way. Losses would be inevitable. Additionally, Axis forces learned how to counter Allied dive bombers through the implementation of metal wires. As Italy is quite mountainous, with peaks and valleys, cliffs and canyons, this gave the defending forces quite a lot to work with in placing anti-aircraft wires. These wires would be strung across mountains and cliffs and such, wires small enough to not really be noticeable, but large enough to tear through the frame of an aircraft. After diving and going into their low return strafing, a decent number of A-36s would end up being lost after colliding with these wires, with some planes outright being ripped in half as a result. Additionally, as the initial order of 500 A-36 aircraft was never added onto and there would only ever be 500 A-36s, attrition and general wear and tear would inevitably start reducing the numbers naturally as the war progressed. The reason that initial 500 order was never added to was because the A-36 was only made as a temporary measure until the new fiscal year rolled around and money for new fighters became available. When that money became available in the new fiscal year late in 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces would order P-51A Mustangs, effectively just the A-36 design, sans the dive brakes and two of the nose-mounted machine guns. The bomb racks would be retained, though. Then, after the British experiment that replaced the Allison engine with a Merlin engine, P-51B and C Mustangs would be ordered, followed later by the most common variant, the P-51D. As the more iconic fighter variants of the Mustang exponentially increased production, the A-36 would gradually fade away and be replaced by those Mustangs also being quite adept at ground attacking, and other improved aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt would also replace the A-36. Regardless of their small production run and rather short career, the A-36 serves mainly today as a rather interesting aspect of the story of one of the most iconic planes from the Second World War. In effect, the A-36 was a necessary stepping stone on the route that led to over 8,000 P-51D Mustangs being made and escorting bombers all across the globe. It gave America the opportunity to push 500 extra Mustangs out when they otherwise wouldn't be able to, and their combat record gave more credence for the production of later fighter variants for the United States. Plus, with there being the British Mustang Mark I, the A-36 Mustang, and the P-51 Mustang, you can say that the early success of the Mustang led to the temporary production of the Mustang until the Mustang could be made. And you're referring to three different but basically the same plane. How both fun and stupid. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. For whatever reason, I really like the idea of naming different planes the exact same thing. Maybe it'll confuse the enemy. They'll say, look out, there's a Mustang up there, and they look up expecting to see a fighter, and they see a Zeppelin just buzzing by. At least it would be kind of funny, and that's kind of what I'm looking for in my military aircraft. Comedy. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.